Good morning. You all are looking so bright and chipper. I hope you're all feeling good, having some partying last night. Hopefully not too much, of course. Would never do that. You guys are in for a serious treat this morning. I've been chatting with Tyler because I didn't realize that I could have slept in an extra 15 minutes, so I got to know him really well. And he has a fantastic presentation prepared for you today. So asset recovery in a remote world, if you were hoping for a different session, now's the time to get to wherever you need to be. But you're going to want to be here to hang out with Tyler. So please welcome to the stage, Tyler.
Thanks. Hey, everybody. First of all, thank you for being here, especially after the big party last night. I know it might have taken a little extra effort to get out this morning, so I'm very appreciative. This is asset recovery in a remote world, otherwise known as how to get your stuff back when it's in as many places as your employees are. The world has kind of changed, so it takes a few different strategies that we've employed. Hopefully it might help you out. But before that, we'll get some boring stuff out of the way. I'm Tyler Talaga, as you've heard. I'm a staff engineer at MyFitnessPal. I started with them in 2022. Before that, I was actually a firefighter. I went into cybersecurity. I developed backgrounds in both offensive and defensive security. But MyFitnessPal lured me to the dark side of IT, and now I get to build things that keep security up at night and not the other way around. So now that that's out of the way. So this is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to go over some common challenges. These are things that every organization kind of runs into in one flavor or another. Like their motivations are going to vary, the challenges are going to vary, but ultimately we're kind of running into the same obstacles. So we're going to talk about how to overcome those. We're going to go over Tines. It's an automation and orchestration platform. I heard that they are also in the expo hall this year, so go say hi if you haven't already. Remember, the goal is to do as little manual effort as possible. It sounds lazy, but you're all intelligent, skilled individuals. I mean that seriously, and you have only a finite amount of time, right? So automate as much as possible, and we're going to kind of get into how to do that with Tines. We're going to talk about the individual pieces and parts that kind of make up this larger effort. They're discrete automations, about 4 in total. And although they make up this holistic effort, you could employ any of them. And as much of any one automation as you'd like, you don't have to employ the entire thing to get the value out of it. So we're going to tie it all together, hopefully help it make a bit more sense at the end. And then if you have any questions at the end, maybe I'll have some answers. If not, we'll kind of go from there. So common challenges. I hesitate to call them the good old days because I'm a remote work enthusiast. I'm sure a lot of you are. I'm sure a lot of you like working from home, but that's not to say that there aren't unique challenges that remote work has kind of introduced. How it used to work is, I would go up to this individual who works, 2 doors down from me and say, hey, your system can't run anything but Catalina anymore. I'm gonna need that. I have this fancy M3 for you. Maybe we'll trade. I'll help you get your files over, and both of us are going to be very happy at the end of the day. So that was a lot simpler back in the day. How it works today is who has what, where are they, why are they working in Siberia, why didn't HR tell me about that, why do they have 2 of them, Ted doesn't need 2, why does he have 2 laptops, how did he acquire 2 of them, why haven't they checked into Jamf in 3 weeks, right? These are all things that we run into. It's not any secret. Another challenge is kind of communicating with these people effectively. For people who work in different time zones, everybody's busy. Again, finite amount of time. We all face that challenge. So if you send a DM, might go ignored. That's sometimes no fault of anybody's. And escalating as necessary. What do you do if you are ignored? And if you sent 2, 3 DMs, what do you do at that point? A couple of clarifications, kind of like what's in scope that we're talking about today. Refreshing assets, it's kind of discussed like refreshing assets en masse, right? Say you've deployed a number of assets that are just old, end of life, You're going to look at kind of like getting a bunch of those back at one time, certain subsets, et cetera. That's kind of like a scheduled, expected workflow, right? Delinquent assets, recovering assets that are kind of MIA. I don't know if anybody attended the flawless MDM communication session yesterday. They talked about a lot of really like good automations for ensuring MDM communication remains intact or repairing MDM communication as necessary. But this is sort of what happens when that doesn't work, you know? You kind of have to communicate with the end user to get that asset back into Jamf and restore that MDM communication. The last one is sort of out of scope because that's more of an ad hoc workflow. That's not really something you could schedule because you want the user to be able to kick that off themselves, right? They left the laptop at the airport, in the back of a taxi cab, et cetera. That can also be handled by automation, but it's sort of a separate, discrete discussion compared to what we're going to be talking about today. Getting in Tines. First off, I'm just a fanboy. I love Tines. It lets you do a lot with a little. I was introduced to Tines when I started working with MyFitnessPal. Prior to that, the things that I do with Tines, I would do with AWS and Lambdas, et cetera. But anything that I was able to do with pure code back in the day, I've been able to replicate in Tines, no problem. That being said, I don't work for Tines. Anything I say or do or discuss up here about Tines, that's only representative of my own viewpoints, doesn't reflect on them at all. A colleague once described Tines as coding with flowcharts, which I find very accurate. You're basically dragging and dropping these distinct actions onto a canvas, and they flow from top to bottom, and they accomplish a lot of the same things that you do with code. On that note, if you come from a programming background, you're going to take to Tines like a duck to water. A lot of the concepts are going to be familiar to you, like consuming APIs, how to deal with them, data types, things like that. But if you don't have a programming background, I really wouldn't worry about it. The barrier to entry to Tines is very, very low. It's going to take you less time to get acquainted with Tines than it would take to learn a new programming language. Bonus, they do still have a community edition. I checked on that this morning. So what you could do is sign up for a free Tines account, and you could have 3 active workflows to kind of explore it, see if it works for your organization or if it works for you. As an example, I built a fantasy football bot back in 2022, I think, actually. I don't know anything about football, but with Tines, I was able to do it pretty okay. While we're on the subject of automation, these are things that I kind of keep in mind when I'm automating anything. It kind of keeps you out of trouble, so to speak. First is safety. Have you taken measures to ensure that your automation won't cause headaches after hours or headaches during business hours? Let's be real. So for example, today we're talking about communicating with potentially a lot of end users at once, tens, hundreds, maybe more. What you don't want to do is inappropriately send a DM to your entire organization. That's a bad look, It kind of decreases people's trust in you. So sensibility. Does the amount of time you're spending to engineer a solution make sense proportionate to the amount of time or effort that you're saving with that automation? For example, if you have to do a 5-minute task once a month and you spend a week, like a full week to engineer a solution to that task, I think there's an XKCD comic about this. It might not make sense. You might need to rethink that a bit. I would say the exception to this rule is if you are learning a new skill or a language, for example, that allows you to accomplish that objective. That's totally different because you're going to reuse that skill or language in the future. That's a different beast. Security. Does your design require you to take unnecessary risks, like embedding credentials or plain text credentials in a script somewhere and leaving it on a system or running it locally? Probably a bad idea. An easy way to think about the security of your automation is if you had to explain it to your CISO, would it make them sad? Would it make them cringe? Would you be like, hey, this is really cool, I saved so much time? They're like, okay, that's cool. Why did you embed admin credentials there? Let's rethink this. So this is what we're going to talk about today. These are the actual automations that, again, make this whole effort work. Bear with me, we're going to kind of talk about like the high level of concepts here, but there is going to be details where necessary. I will link a GitHub repository at the end. There will be a companion article made available for this presentation as well. I'll make the slides available. So you can kind of stay high level or get into the minutia as you prefer. Key takeaway here, I'm bad at flowcharts. So no secret there. The other thing to take away is don't try to digest this whole thing. You're going to see this again. Don't worry about it. But we're also going to talk about the high-level objectives as well. The other thing to keep in mind is every arrow that you see up there, whether it's in between those elements or the larger one down there, Tines is that arrow. Tines makes that integration work for us. So it connects our Jamf Pro instance to our CMDB, CMDB to Airtable, Slack to Airtable, and vice versa. Every arrow is Tines. So just something to kind of keep in mind there when you're looking at this. So a bit more about these in detail. The primary flows here are identification, identifying the assets that you need to reacquire for whatever reason, talking to users who have those assets, that's communication. Your users are your best leads when they're out in the wild somewhere. Successfully reclaiming those assets. Reclamation has a lot to do with removing every obstacle that you can from your end users so they could successfully get them back to you. And finally, deletion, which is talking about purging those records not only from Jamf Pro, but also your constituent tools. What other platforms is your asset checking into, whether it's your EDR, VM, et cetera. Just something to keep in mind when you do get those assets back. So we're going to talk about identification. This one's going to go kind of quick because it's somewhat the simplest, but it's arguably the most important because this is your foundation for the rest of the automations. It pretty much always starts with Jamf Pro. It's no secret. That's why we're all here today. By extension, Apple Business Manager and Apple School Manager, those kind of come, come before Jamf Pro. But you're going to want to get those assets into a CMDB or asset database. Jamf Pro is not an asset database. If you're kind of using Jamf Pro as an asset database, please stop. Get an asset database immediately. Asset hygiene makes everything else work. Patch management, security, et cetera. It's the foundation for everything. Finally, Airtable doesn't have to be Airtable, and we'll talk about that. But what that essentially is, it's an intermediary data store that you're extracting a subset of assets from your CMDB. You're storing in Airtable because you're going to want it to track a lot of sort of ephemeral data that's not going to be attached to that asset for the life of the asset. For example, if you want to record what a user said, do I still have that asset? I want to send it back, et cetera. Store a FedEx tracking number. Don't stick that in your CMDB. That's not a great place for it. The CMDB is a place for your persistent attributes, right? So again, identification. I'm not going to go too deep because of the wide range of motivations that can be in place here, but a couple of examples would be like end-of-life assets. Most likely, if you deployed a large number of assets at the same time, that's going to have a lot to do with like when you need to get those assets back, because eventually Apple's going to stop supporting them, right? So if you have 500 out there, 100 are end of life. Maybe you don't want to reacquire 20% of your assets at one time, but you might kind of divvy that up depending on department or something like that. Multiple assets. Do users have multiple assets? Do they need to have multiple assets? That's something you can kind of track via your CMDB and say, okay, give me all the owners that have 2 assets. Let me talk to them. Let me see which one they actually need to hang on to. Again, it just kind of matters. What actually matters is getting a balance of the assets back that you actually care about. And then remember that every asset out there should eventually make its way back to you. So if you do have like a really strong onboarding flow and you're able to get an asset in that user's hands in a short amount of time, that's awesome. That's kind of part one though. You have to remember it's like, okay, I'm giving this asset to the user. I will eventually be getting this asset back, right? Unless your organization plans on just kind of like gifting assets to offboarded users, in which case, hook me up. If you have any part-time work, that sounds awesome. So moving on to communication. So reclaiming is important. Ultimately getting the asset back is important, but you're not going to be able to reclaim that asset without communicating with your end users effectively. And what you don't want to do is communicate with your end users manually. You don't want to send 50 DMs manually, a day, a week, et cetera, because sending is fine. That's not that hard, but you're also going to have to get those responses back and keep the responses somewhere, right? So again, your users are your best leads. Once you deploy that asset, you're kind of like a detective, and you're like, well, this is the first 48. Who would I talk to about this crime that just happened? I would talk to the user. They were the one that last saw it, right? So the idea with communication is you want to start early. Don't wait, because the more time you wait to talk about that asset, the more things that can happen to it. Goes in the closet, leave it at a friend's house, et cetera. Nudge them often, and then grease the runway as much as possible, make it as easy as possible for that user to give you that asset back, but also escalate as necessary. Communication. So I talk a lot about Slack here. You saw that in the flow chart, et cetera. Doesn't have to be Slack. These automations are designed to be somewhat vendor agnostic. So if you use if you use Teams, is there anyone here that uses IRC by chance? Anyone remember IRC? No? I'm dating myself, I guess. Thank goodness. But again, Slack is entirely optional. The idea here is, like so for example, the fantasy football bot that I built, I use Telegram there. Interactivity is possible in Telegram. Interactivity is possible in Teams. Interactivity is definitely possible in Slack. You want a way to automate that interactivity, reach out to the end user automatically, retrieve the response, and update or send a new DM as necessary. Persistence is key. You may have to follow up, and you likely will have to follow up multiple times. Don't kind of plan to do that already. Plan to not receive a response back and have a plan C, because plan B might fail, and plan A has already failed. That's the reality of it, right? Have a backup plan. Slack, again, another note about Slack. We use bots to do darn near everything at MyFitnessPal. We use a lot of bots, or we have a certain bot act and perform multiple different roles. Bots are huge. There's a lot of really good documentation about setting up a Slack app from scratch. I'll provide a link at the end of this presentation to help you do that. It's kind of difficult to talk about it because a lot of the ideas are a bit ethereal. So trying to picture what's going on or follow a guide from up here, a little bit difficult to do. One thing to note though, you have to handle interactivity somehow. Sending a DM is great, and maybe that's your step one, just kind of get that communication out there, that's awesome. But ultimately, receiving that information is as equally important or more important. Basically, the pattern that we use is send, receive, update the initial DM, receive again, and then finally close out that communication. These are the Slack endpoints that we use. Again, we use the first one to actually send that initial DM, get that communication into the hands of the end user. And then we use the second one up there to update that message. So again, we send, receive, update, receive again. So that pattern allows you to do a lot with a little, and it allows you to do things like get a lot of communication accomplished without sending 10 different DMs. These endpoints, this is sort of just a note to make you aware that they exist and what we're doing. But again, there's a GitHub repository right at the end that will allow you to kind of dig into these and see what the responses look like and things like that. This is an actual look at the time story that we use to collect user input. You'll see that we have the webhook set up top. So anytime a user checks a box, hits a button, types something in, hits submit, it all goes to that webhook. And then we parse what they did or how they responded, and we handle it with basically if-else or trigger conditions, and we handle it accordingly. But you can see if the user selected, I still have that asset, or the asset is unrecognized, or even better, if they say, yeah, I have this asset and I want to send it back, you can see one flow up there, kind of hard to see, but basically what happens is we say, oh, they want to send it back. Let's go ahead and generate a tracking number for them via FedEx or a return label. We're going to check to see what locations are around them for FedEx, and we're going to provide that location to the end user. And we'll talk about that in FedEx in a little bit here. Sending new DMs versus updating existing, you could do it either way, and there are advantages to both. The reason that we just update DMs in place instead of sending a brand new DM, sending a new DM will notify the end user, and that's great. But it seems to be a more contiguous line of communication if the end user just is able to select an option from a dropdown and the DM just updates in place. It feels more smooth for the end user is the feedback that we've gotten. Saving your interactions is one of the most important pieces up here, and that's where Airtable or even Google Sheets or something like that comes in. We'll talk about that next. But again, persistence is key. When you're communicating, be as persistent as possible, escalate as necessary, et cetera, et cetera. So Airtable, by a show of hands, anybody use Airtable today? Awesome, okay. So if you don't use Airtable, this isn't like a call to action to like go back to your manager and be like, hey, we need to start using Airtable to make this work. Use whatever you need. Again, it's an intermediary data store. Google Sheets works just fine. I've used Google Sheets before to do this sort of automation. It works just fine. The strengths with Airtable, though, are a few, and I'll get into that. But it's sort of a halfway between a spreadsheet and a full-fledged database. One of my coworkers recently described it as if Excel and Microsoft Access had a baby, and I promise it does not live up to the horror that that sentiment implies. I promise. But basically, so it has tremendous capabilities with both presentation, and their API is fantastic to work with. If I had to choose between the API for Google Sheets and the API for Airtable, I would pick Airtable. It's just much easier. It makes things a lot easier to kind of process things through automations. This is an example dashboard. Key takeaway from this dashboard is I'm also bad at dashboards. And it's kind of an easy way. The thing about this, though, is like it's a GUI-based editor in Airtable, so you can put this together in like 3 minutes. And this is exactly what I put together for my IT manager when we were talking about, hey, should we be worried about the number of assets for our current refresh? How are we looking? What assets are kind of in process? What assets have been delivered, et cetera, et cetera. It's super easy to put together. So this is an actual video, just some pretense here. The bottom is an Airtable that we would use for reclaiming assets. The top is an actual Slack interaction. So basically how this works is the message that you see at the top is from our RT support bot. Might be kind of hard to see up there. But basically the question is, hey, your asset hasn't checked into Jamf Pro in a little while. Do you still got it? Do you recognize it? What's going on here? We've already created a record in Airtable for this asset. It has our CMDB URL. It has the Jamf last contact in there. It says who the user is for the owner, what the serial is, et cetera. So we kind of set ourselves up for success, and then based on how the Slack interaction goes, we'll actually store responses in Airtable for this record. So you can see for Slack, anytime you select the dropdown, you can configure it to like basically function as an action. So the user doesn't have to hit a separate discrete button or anything like that. Every time they select an option, it counts as an interaction. We receive that response, we store it. What you see here is I basically said, yeah, I still have this asset, I want to give it back. So what we're doing now is we're collecting the user's address. We're going to generate a FedEx return label for that user. We're going to see what locations are around that user for FedEx, and we're going to tell them about it. Takes just a second because we hit the FedEx API. You'll see we provided the end user with the shipping label, basically instructions on what to do next. And we've also, if we did receive a real tracking number, it's not a real address, so we didn't get one, we would insert that tracking number so our IT analyst can also track the progress of that returned asset. So reclamation, the idea here is you want to make it as easy as possible for your end users. Remove every obstacle you possibly can because you want to help them get it back to you. They're your greatest strength. They're the ones who are responsible for the asset. Not only are they going to be a primary resource for the information about that asset, they are going to help you get it back. And so you just need to make it as easy as possible for them. As a comparison, think about how easy it is to return an Amazon package. Like you could select it and be like, I just don't want it anymore. And they're like, great, give it back. Drop it off here, here's your label. That's how easy it needs to be for your end users. Again, communicate tracking info to everyone who needs to know it and store it. Again, we store it in Airtable. And then we also track updates about that asset as it kind of goes through that process. FedEx, again, designed to be vendor agnostic. We use FedEx just because we had that business account already. You could use UPS, you could use DHL, whatever you want, whatever you'd like, as long as it has an API. A couple requirements for FedEx, though. Of course, you have to have a business account already. you need to set up a developer account, and then you need to set up a project for that developer account in order to start like kind of working on the collections that make available. The approval process is actually pretty straightforward. Basically, you use the sandbox that they provide to generate sample labels. You send your sample labels to the FedEx developer team, and they return a production API key. The whole process for us, I think, took about 2 business days. So it was super, super simple. I don't know if that's as expected, if that was fast, slow, et cetera, but they seem to be pretty on top of it. And we did that a couple of years ago, and it's worked fantastic ever since. So there doesn't seem to be like a re-certification process or anything like that. More FedEx fun. So the shipping collection, that's the one that actually requires approval because that's tied to your account. They don't want you generating erroneous tracking labels, or return labels rather, just because that affects them as well, right? That's kind of like entering the real world. Whatever label you've applied to that asset actually needs to work and function as FedEx expects it to. The track and locate endpoints though, like if you set up a project today and get your key, you don't actually need approval for those. So again, if you want to piecemeal these automations and you don't want to like start generating return labels right away and just do that manually, you can. Go ahead and track updates about those assets automatically. You could still locate the nearest FedEx location for the end user. You could do all of that just today. You don't need to get approved for that. Again, pertinent endpoints here. Just a reminder, these will be in the GitHub repo. Don't worry about trying to memorize these or write these down. These are all ship endpoints for that particular collection. Any of these you'll need approval to use. First one, obviously you could create a send or return label. So if you're actually onboarding a user, you could use the FedEx API to generate a send label to start that process. But if they already have it, then you would generate a return label. You could cancel a shipment. That's kind of as it sounds. If a label got created that you decide is like, we're not actually going to use that, or it was generated with the wrong address, you could kill that label if you'd like. You could validate a created shipment. If you want like extra error handling, that's not a bad idea, just to make sure that you did it properly and the return label that you have out there is actually going to work for the end user when they try to go to the FedEx location to use it. More pertinent endpoints. These are kind of like the remainder of what we use FedEx for. The first one, kind of self-explanatory. That's how we actually get the updates for the tracking number that we've generated. So a good way to think about that is like if you're just hitting the FedEx API every half hour or so, you could basically tell your IT analyst when delivery has been made. So they're not constantly checking on that tracking number. So like, okay, is it downstairs when you go down to the office, et cetera. Second one, notifications. You can actually control what notifications are sent to the end user for updates about that tracking number. I believe those notifications also go to the account to which that asset is going. And then finally, the last one, locations, that's super, super helpful. If you think about it like from the perspective of the end user, again, you're removing the obstacles. So if they're sitting there and saying, I don't even know if there is a FedEx around me, I haven't used FedEx, I haven't gone to a real FedEx location in such a long time, that's just another way for you to be like, don't even worry about it, we've done the legwork for you, just go to this address, right? Finally, cleaning up after yourself is huge. Housekeeping is key here because stale records will come back to haunt you. Often in ways you didn't anticipate. So if you don't purge your records from all your constituent tooling, it's going to make life harder down the road. So just save yourself the unnecessary headaches. Asset erasures, this is something that makes our IT analyst life a lot easier. Basically, how we expose that trigger is he or she can access that asset via their mobile device, basically just scanning a barcode that we've applied to the asset. And they set attributes in our CMDB according to like where that asset is. So essentially it'd be in inventory and it'd be pending erasure. That tells a webhook that we set up in Tines to say, oh, this asset is on location, we have the asset, it's safe to wipe. Wipes the asset via Jamf Pros API, and then it also goes down and it kills those records in our EDR and our VM. The reason that's so important is, especially for vulnerability management, for a lot of VM platforms, if the asset doesn't check in and the VM tooling isn't able to say, oh yeah, these vulnerabilities are no longer here based on versioning for software or something like that, those vulnerabilities just hang around. And all of a sudden your numbers look crappy because you have old records in your VM platform. It's no good. Jamf's API, again, sample code has been provided in the GitHub repo in case you needed to get started. We'll talk about alternate libraries and things like that in a second, but there is a really good Python SDK out there. I think Bryson Tyrell, apologize if I messed up that name, he has a great SDK, recommend its use. Doesn't quite fit in our use case, so we don't have it in our org, but I would recommend it based on what I've heard. Also, think about locking returned assets. It's usually a good idea, just kind of like prevent anybody from tampering with that while it's en route. A laptop box is kind of easy to identify, so just kind of keep that in the back of your head. Also, if you aren't already, I would suggest starting to use Jamf's clients or API clients and roles feature. I think it makes a lot more sense than trying to create like a GUI user that could actually try and log in or worry about them logging into the GUI and just using that for your API creds. It seems a bit more robust and kind of a more mature process in my opinion. So wrapping up, again, certain challenges that we're all gonna face if you have a remote environment. Who has what? Where the heck are they? Why do they have multiple assets? And again, why are they not checking in Jamf Pro? A couple of new tools and techniques. Again, if you don't have an asset database, please get one. Think about an intermediary data store because it's a lot easier to affect and manipulate those records in kind of a downstream platform that is gonna mess with your asset database. So your IT analyst can make notes and things like that as well to kind of track its process. And also, build as you go. You don't need to do all of this tomorrow to get some value out of it. But decide where your biggest pain points are in this process. If it's just generating FedEx tracking labels, then do that. Or if you kind of need to clean up your asset database because it's not, your asset hygiene isn't great, start there. You can start wherever in this process, but the idea is to kind of automate as much as humanly possible. So just you can make life easier on yourself, right? A few helpful resources. Tines, highly recommend checking out their website. They have a lot of really good documentation there. They have a Tines bootcamp. And the boot camps are both interactive and recorded. So you can do either one, whatever you'd like. They have a couple certifications there to test your skills as well. I already see a lot of you scanning the QR code, sorry. I'm not trying to fish anybody. That goes to the GitHub that I posted there. That will have a lot of the information we talked about today in more depth. It'll have the endpoints that we've talked about, sample responses and things like that. There is sample code up there written in Python to help you kind of get going. But I do also mention other helpful alternative libraries that are a bit more fully featured in case you want to use the code for other things. Oh, and then the last, that's just my website. I do have a lot of blog posts about how to set up a Slack app from scratch if you haven't done that before. 3-part series there. There's a lot of detail, probably unnecessarily detailed. But I would recommend going there to check out that if you haven't done anything with Slack's API before. Questions? See a few hands already. I think she's gonna kind of work her way around to kind of come to you.
Thank you. Are you sending users a box to mail their stuff back with? Or are they responsible for packing and shipping?
That's a really great question. We do a couple of things there. One way we do it is to have them hang on the box that we sent them in the first place. I know that's not always realistic because we do send them a laptop box, and to ask them to hang on to it long term is kind of iffy, especially if they're a long-term user. That's not always realistic. Sometimes we provide them an account number that they could use at the location, but often, yeah, exactly. So we can do that securely, but another way to do that is to kind of just reimburse them for the box at the location. And that seems to work okay too. The thing about the return label though is the majority of the cost is just expense to the organization, so that does help and kind of prevents unnecessary costs at the location. So.
Getting the steps in.
Good morning. When you remove the device from Jamf, are you extracting any data from Jamf, like the FTE key or firmware keys for later use, or are you making sure all the devices are wiped at that time? My issue is occasionally I remove a device from Jamf and I brick it because I don't have the right information.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a really good question. Basically, I would say that most everything in Jamf, that's available in Jamf, we do try and store in the CMDB in a way that's only accessible to people who need to access it. Because some of that stuff isn't for everybody's eyes, obviously. But yeah, that's a really good question, something to think about before you wipe the device.
Thank you.
Of course.
Return labels, do they need to be printed as well? Because not all companies allow printing.
That's a great question. Yeah, so the way that we do it is we actually provide the user a link via Slack. And what they can do is basically just provide that via the mobile device when they're at the FedEx location, and the FedEx personnel can actually just scan that. And then they can just kind of do it that way. But that's a great question. Yeah, we don't require the user to print the label themselves. I would say, sorry, just one note though. So the FedEx label will be also emailed to the user automatically via FedEx. That's something that we have to do. And they'll instruct the end user, like if they do print the label, that link is gonna be unusable from there on. So just a thought.
So one question I have is, what do you do for terminations in this case for recovery? Because obviously if they're terminated, they're not gonna have access to Slack. So what kind of communication have you done with those employees?
That's a great question. So one thing that I forgot to mention is I would highly recommend giving your policies, your administrative policies, some teeth, and not to be mean or anything like that, but if you basically need to apply pressure to the employee to be like, hey, give them the impression of like, hey, this is a company asset. We do need this back when we've given it to you, and kind of maintain that impression throughout your relationship. But for terminated employees, so they do get an email to their personal email. We kind of keep the secondary or personal email in a way that we can access it, and we kind of maintain that because we have their personal email from when they got hired. So we just kind of store that in a way that kind of hangs around for when we need it. And then FedEx actually sends them a label to that email, if that makes sense.
It does, and I guess I'm more at the point where like Slack for the communication, when you have your drop downs and your questions like, hey, do you still have this asset?
Right.
You're putting that information into Tines at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Are you doing the same thing with the users at this point? Personal email is going into Tines and at that point, their communication that way, or is that being stored separately?
So good question. It's actually a discrete process. So we handle refreshed assets different than terminated employees. When a termination occurs, it actually flows down a different automation. And we basically kind of handle it from there. We have their address stored. We can just kind of assume. So the other thing to think about with return labels is their sending address isn't as important as your company address that you feed the API. So as long as the company address is correct, I don't recommend doing this, but you can provide your company address in both slots, right? The sending and the receiving, and it'll get there eventually, from our experience, if you don't have the user's address for whatever reason. But we actually don't interact with the end user to say, hey, like, do you still have that asset? We just assume that they do until proven otherwise, and we just use the information that we have on file to get them a return label at that point.
Yeah, because I think our biggest issue is we get a terminated employee, and then for our company, HR is the only one that really can communicate with them, and that's the biggest issue of, hey, we sent a box, but we have nothing else from that point.
Right.
And then a comment for the gentleman that asked about deleting a device out of Jamf. For my company, we set up a workflow with it. We use ServiceNow, but we did a termination workflow there where we have a task one for wiping the device, and then once it's done, we have a cascading task after that to delete the record out of Jamf at that point. So we can verify someone signed off that the device has been deleted at that point before we wipe it or before we delete it out of Jamf.
That's a great thought. I like that a lot.
More questions? Saw there was a lot of people taking pictures, taking notes. This is very informative. Thank you, Tyler.